Hello, welcome to the first of 3 videos on financial market benchmarks, specifically the changes being made to them, the progress made so far, and how the changes will impact market participants. Benchmarks such as LIBOR are used as reference rates for trillions of dollars in notional of interest rate derivatives trades, so having robust and reliable benchmarks is critical. Regulators and industry participants have been working on a number of initiatives to strengthen key benchmarks by making the existing interbank or IBOR benchmarks more robust and by selecting new alternative risk-free rates and encouraging their use, among other things. Each strand of that work will have an impact on end users, so firms need to be aware of what's happening and when the changes will be made. In this video, we'll look at the work to select new alternative risk-free rates, and to do that, I'm joined by Katherine Darras, General Counsel at ISDA. So Katherine, let's start off with some background. What's being done and why?
This all stems from recommendations made by the Financial Stability Board for changes to be made to certain critical benchmark rates to ensure they're more robust and less susceptible to manipulation. One of those recommendations was to establish and select risk-free rates as an alternative to existing benchmarks such as LIBOR, and to encourage use of the new rates in the future. So there's been a number of public-private sector working groups who have looked at identifying the risk-free rates. In the US, this has been led by the Federal Reserve, in Japan by the Bank of Japan, and in the UK by the Bank of England.
So what progress has been made so far?
Quite a bit recently, in fact. In the US, the ARC committee has recently announced the selection of a broad Treasury repo financing rate. This followed the selection by the Sterling Group of Sonia, and late last year in Japan, the Japanese group selected Tona.
So they've made the selections, they've chosen risk-free rates. What happens now? What's the market doing to transition to those new rates?
The timeline for transition has not been set, but now that the risk-free rates have been selected, the focus will inevitably turn to how to encourage use of those rates and develop a robust implementation plan. So this is a complex process and not subject to a one-size-fits-all plan, but we do think there's some high-level principles that can govern these transitions. So for instance, we think it's important that there's sufficient liquidity in the alternate rates to support their role as key market benchmarks. In addition, there has to be ample time for market participants to make the necessary changes to systems, processes, and documentation. And separately, it looks like for these 3 transitions that they will focus on new trades only, which will avoid big shifts in valuations. These 3 public-private sector working groups are aware of all of these issues, and they're also committed to a broad consultation with various sectors of the industry to develop as successful a transition as possible.
So you've talked about progress in Japan, in the UK and the US. What about Europe? What's happening there?
Well, in Europe, there's currently no formal public-private sector working group that's in place to choose an alternative risk-free rate in Europe, so there's less certainty. The public-private sector cooperation has been very successful in the other 3 markets, so we do encourage the ECB to increase its involvement in this work.
So what's ISDA doing?
Well, ISDA has been an observer on the 3 public-private sector working groups. We also stand ready to help with implementation solutions and market education. And of course, to the extent that documentation changes are needed, we would help in that area also. This is in addition to our work to develop IBOR fallbacks.
Thanks, Katherine. The work on fallbacks is very important and could affect existing contracts linked to certain IBOR rates. We'll discuss that in more detail in our next video.